Hello everyone and welcome back to our series of lectures on scale development. So this is part 3 already. In part 1, I talked about an introduction to scale development and the importance of developing good scales. I also talked about what scales do in terms of measuring the latent construct or the hypothetical construct. In part 2, I talked about important characteristics of a good scale in terms of design properties, in terms of validity and reliability. And for today, we will talk about some guidelines in scale development, particularly in terms of writing the items and the things that you have to consider when you write the items. So the very first step really is to determine clearly what it is that you want to measure. Oftentimes, novice researchers are not really knowledgeable about what they want to measure. So again, you're measuring a particular hypothetical construct. But before we proceed, I think I haven't mentioned this before. My message to everyone who is considering developing their own scale is that this should actually be your last resort. There are already many scales available, and if you are about to conduct a research and you need an instrument to measure for a particular variable, the first thing that you have to do really is to look at the literature and see what's out there, see what's available. And as much as possible, you really would want to use scales that have already been developed, because why go through the trouble of establishing construct validity when there are existing scales that are already valid and that have some evidence of validity? We only develop scales for situations wherein the use of existing scale is no longer an option, and that the construct that we want to measure is really kind of novel and unique, and there are no existing scales that measure such construct. And because we will develop items that represent sample behaviors that are manifestations of these constructs, it's important that you fully understand what the construct is, how it is defined, what are the parameters of the construct, what the construct is, as much as what the construct is not. That is very, very important. So identify what you exactly want to measure, and with the aid of the theory, define it exhaustively. So first of all, our definitions should not be personal definitions. Our definitions should not be based on our personal experiences or an opinion. As much as possible, we want our definitions to be theory-based. Now, how does the theory, or how do theories define the construct that we want to measure? And then we define it exhaustively. So theory is very important in doing so. Identify the boundaries of the construct, not only in terms of what it is, but also what it is not. First, some simple things that you should ask about the construct. Is the construct a trait? If it's a trait, then that means to say that it's relatively stable. It's something that is developed probably beginning from childhood. Perhaps we are born with some temperament towards this trait, and our specific unique environment enhance this particular characteristic. Is it a cognition? Is it a thought, a belief? Something that we can consider as a cognition. Is it an affect? Compared to cognitions and traits, we know affect to be less stable, so that should also influence some of your decisions in writing the items, and also the response set. So you have to be very clear about what your construct is. Is it a behavior? Are we talking about actions? And is the question how oftentimes you perform this particular action? When I validate students' instruments, sometimes I would encounter a set of items that are meant to measure a particular construct, but some of the items seem to be invoking some kind of cognition, some seem to be invoking some kind of affect, some kind of trait, some kind of behavior. So there's no consistency. And so you have to be very aware in terms of what you are measuring. Another thing is that sometimes you have to understand that you're measuring a single thing, a single construct. Sometimes I validate instruments, or I validate student scales, and they say that what they want to measure is the effect of something on something. That clearly is not an objective for scale development. The fact that you're saying you want to measure the effect of something implies the relationship between two variables already. But in here, we're just talking about a single construct, a single variable, and how you can assess that. So again, you have to be very clear about what you want to measure. If I want to measure academic self-efficacy, then I have to have a clear understanding of what self-efficacy is. Self-efficacy is a belief. That means to say that it's some kind of cognition. If it's a belief, then that will inform how I will phrase the items. If I'm describing somebody's belief from, let's say, for example, from a person perspective, then I might write items such as, I know, cognition, that I can succeed in doing this particular task. I am confident that I can perform this task. So if you will notice, I'm not saying I will do this, right? Because I'm not measuring a behavior. My choice of words are words that invokes cognition. Scale specifically can vary along a number of dimensions: content domain, setting, and population. So these are some of the things that you should consider in developing your items. What is your content domain? What is the setting? What is the population? And so of course, if you will measure academic self-efficacy, then you will be measuring this from a population of students, and then the setting is the school, and that will also inform partly of how you will write the items. So if it's a belief about being successful academically, then you'll be using words such as the performing an assignment, performing an academic task, so forth and so on. Ask yourself if the construct you wish to measure is distinct from another construct. Again, sometimes students develop scales which are not really different from other constructs. Constructs that actually already have measures for. It's possible that the construct that you want to measure is really unique, but can be quite similar or overlapping with another construct. So make sure that you know where the delineation is. Similar items may tap to quite different constructs. For example, tapping social anxiety when the interest is test anxiety can be a bit problematic. You want to measure test anxiety, but some of your items leans more towards measuring social anxiety rather than test anxiety. After articulating the purpose of the scale, begin constructing the instrument. Generate a large pool of items that are candidates to the eventual inclusion in the scale. An item is typically a declarative sentence that illustrates a behavior or thoughts that would be true if the construct exists in the individual. Now we go back to our previous example of items that supposedly measure aspiration for children's achievement. So these are declarative sentence. Now, part 4 will actually talk about response set. And I think when you write these items, I think that is something that you also have to consider. So when I say response set, so these are the options that the test taker will select. And the response set can be, for example, in terms of level of agreement. So there is a range of options ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. There are also response sets that indicate frequency, ranging from never to almost always. So that's another kind of response set. There's also a response set that asks whether the statement is true to you or not true to you. So my point is that when you write the items, it's important that you already have an idea of what the response set is gonna be. Because if your response set is level of agreement, then that will inform the way you phrase your items. And if your response set is measuring frequency of performance, that also has a consequence, or that should also be a consideration in terms of how you write your items. So bottom line is, when you write your items, you already must know what your response set is gonna be. Before I continue, I'm inviting everyone to please subscribe to my channel. 90% of the people who are watching my lectures and tutorials are not subscribed. So if I am of help to you, I would really appreciate it if you can subscribe to my channel. That way you're helping me and also helping my channel reach more people. Thank you very much. Items should be selected or created with a specific measurement goal in mind. The definition of the construct in the description of exactly what the scale is intended to do should guide this process. So again, as you're writing the items, you must be completely aware of what you want to measure and how this construct is defined. Each item must be sensitive to the true score of the latent variable. My response to a particular item should be moved and determined by that construct within me. If I have high academic self-efficacy, my high academic self-efficacy should inform me to strongly agree with a statement that describes a person who has high academic self-efficacy. Now, when you develop the items, there are two general ways by which you can do so. So the first one is, you can generate the items solely based on the theoretical or conceptual definition. So that means to say that I myself will create the items solely based on the theoretical definition of the items. Now the other way, the relatively more tedious but probably more informed way of generating items, is generating items based on the response from a sample of participants, but still guided by theory. So this might require some form of simple qualitative study, and from this qualitative study, you can generate items from that. So for example, in my dissertation, one of the variables that I intended to measure is motivational problems. So motivational problems are essentially things that hinder individuals, students, from accomplishing academic tasks. And in the literature, there is already some sort of taxonomy of motivational problems, but the thing is that there are no existing measures of these motivational problems. So some of the motivational problems include environmental distraction, personal distraction, task difficulty, perception of lack of ability, so forth and so on. So there are existing categories of motivational problems. So I could have simply, because there are conceptual definitions, I could have simply created items based on that. However, given that my participants are rather unique and have a specific unique context, my participants are those who are reviewing for civil engineering board examination, I wasn't exactly sure if their experience of motivational problems are exactly the same as the ones that are described in the literature. So I took time in conducting a simple interview, a simple qualitative analysis, just to kind of verify if the motivational problems described in the literature is the same as the ones that are actually experienced by the participants. So I interviewed about 20 individuals who are reviewing for civil engineering. The interviews lasted for about 20 minutes, and basically the question is, when you notice that your motivation for reviewing, for studying is declining, what do you typically attribute the decline to? And by asking that, I'm essentially asking, what are the hindrances and what are the motivational problems that you have experienced? And so we analyzed the data through content analysis. There were 3 of us. So first, I read the transcript. I selected the phrases which I think demonstrate a motivational problem. So these are the excerpts. So you can see here in this column. And then I tried to simplify that. I tried to paraphrase it. And then I sent these information to 2 other raters. And based on the code book, so we have a code book here. So this code book is based on the definition of the motivational problems in literature. So as you can see here, problem with regard to situation, interest, value, task difficulty, cognitive readiness, and then these are the respective definitions. We coded these items whether they fall under physical readiness, situational distraction, task difficulty, so forth and so on. And in retrospect, it was good that I did that because what I've learned is that among these particular individuals, the problem with regard to situation interest is not really a thing. I'm not exactly sure why. Probably because they find topics in engineering quite interesting. So this didn't seem to be a problem. But there is one problem that emerged which wasn't mentioned in the literature, and that is urgency, or the lack of urgency. And so that informed the development of my scale. So in the scale that I developed, I removed problems with regard to situation interest, and then I added another dimension, which is lack of urgency. And it is from these responses that we develop the items for. So we use these responses to generate the items. Okay. But of course, that is after we have agreed on our coding, because there are three of us who coded. Sometimes we disagreed, and then we have to resolve that first. And then after that, after the final coding, we use the excerpts as basis for the generation of the items. Now, I understand that that might sounded very tedious, and it is quite tedious, but there is some value to that which I have described. No? Based on the responses, a new construct sort of emerged from the analysis. So whether or not you will develop the items based on the theoretical definition or more of a ground-up approach, it depends on you. Probably it also depends on your time restrictions, and it depends on whether or not you think the reality of the construct might be different from how it is described in the literature. Think creatively about the construct you seek to measure. Think of different ways an item can be reworded so as to get at the construct. Exhaust the possibilities for types of items within the bounds of the definition of the construct. The thing that the items have in common should truly be a construct. So as you are writing the items, these are some of the things that you have to pay attention to. So number one is redundancy. We know that when we read these items, we've taken tests like this, we do feel a sense of redundancy. It seems that every item is similar to another item. And redundancy is both a good and a bad feature of an item. It's good because it makes the scale more inclusive. The theoretical models that guide our scale development efforts are based on redundancy. Based on using multiple and seemingly redundant items, the content that is common to the items will summate across items, while their relevant idiosyncrasies will cancel out. Useful redundancies pertain to the construct, not the incidental aspects of the items. So let me give you some examples. So here's an example of a good redundancy. I will do almost anything to ensure my child's success. An item in our aspirations for children scale. And then no sacrifice is too great if it helps my child succeed. So both of which are descriptions of an individual who is willing to do anything, even a sacrifice, for the sake of their children's success. So essentially, they're kind of talking about the same thing in a slightly different manner. Now, this is a good redundancy. This, however, is a bad redundancy. A really important thing is my child's success, and the really important thing is my child's success. So it's a bad redundancy because they are identical with the exception of the article. One uses a, the other uses the, which is barely a difference. Redundant, superficial item characteristics such as incidental, construct, irrelevant vocabulary, or grammatical structure is a case of bad redundancy. Item begin with a common phrase. For example, all items begin when I think about it may cause those items to correlate more strongly with one another than expected. So when you write items, that's another tip. Make sure that the items do not have a common beginning stem, because that may make the items correlate more strongly. Even items which should not be correlating might correlate because they share the same beginning stem. Now, when you write items, another question would be, how many items should I write? One, you should write considerably more items than you plan to include in your scale. Lots of items can be a form of insurance against poor internal consistency. So maybe you can do as small as 50% larger than the final scale. So you intend to have a 10 item scale, you generate 50% larger, so that is 15. Or it could also be as much as a 200% larger, which is 40 items for an intended of 10 item scale. Personally, my take on this is I'm not in favor of having too many items. Sometimes when there are, let's say for example, 40 items, sometimes the quality of the items are not very good anymore. You're just kind of forcing yourself to write an item. So my suggestion is that write as many as you can, and you feel that the items are still of high quality. There's enough redundancy that is good, no more than bad types of redundancies. All of the items still are within the parameters of how you define the construct. But don't force yourself to prepare 40 items if you only intend 10 items in the scale. Oftentimes, my experience is that large number of items can introduce a lot of complexities, especially in the statistical analysis when you get to your exploratory factor analysis or confirmatory factor analysis. So to me, I think I prefer the first option, which is to have maybe 50% larger than what you intend. So if you intend a 10 item scale, maybe preparing 15 would be sufficient. Begin the process of writing the items. Start with a statement that simply paraphrases the construct. For example, if you intend to measure self-perceived susceptibility to commercial messages, then you simply say, I am susceptible to commercial messages. That's a declarative statement that simply tells the reader that he is susceptible to commercial messages. And then the response that probably will be whether you agree to this or you disagree, or whether you think this is true of you or not true of you. And then try to generate additional statements that get the same idea but said in a slightly different way. For example, commercial messages affect me a lot. Initially, impose minimal quality standards on the statements. You can write as many as you can, and then later on just filter out the bad ones. The goal is to simply identify a wide variety of ways in which the central concept can be stated. Seek alternative ways of expressing critical ideas. For example, instead of saying commercial messages, you can say things that I see on TV or magazine ads. So write as many as you can. Initially, don't impose any quality control. After you've written, then you can kind of screen the items which you think are better than the others. After generating 3 or 4 times the number of items, examine how well the items capture the central idea. Examine the clarity of expression. Is there a need to improve grammar? And then, select the best ones. Another tip, avoid lengthy items. Length increases complexity and diminishes clarity. So here's a bad example. It is fair to say that one of the things that I seem to have a problem with much of the time is getting my point across to other people, which is practically the same as saying I often have difficulty making a point. So the second one is better because it's short, it's concise, it communicates the same statement or the same idea versus the first one, which is rather lengthy and very convoluted. Consider reading difficulty level. Aim for a reading level between 5th to 7th grades. This is an appropriate target for most instruments that will be used with the general population. So what I say to most students is, try to write as simple as possible. So avoid using complex words. Try to write simply, in a straightforward manner. Avoid multiple negatives. So here's a bad example. I am not in favor of corporations stopping funding for anti-nuclear groups. So it's a triple negative, no? So there's not, stopping, and then anti, which can be very confusing. A better one is, I favor continued private support of groups advocating nuclear ban. However, word of caution, these two things are not exactly the same. Okay, so they're not exactly the same. Favoring groups that are advocating for nuclear ban is not the same as not favoring corporations who do not fund anti-nuclear groups. But you get my point, no? So as much as possible, try to avoid multiple negatives in a statement. Avoid double-barreled items. What are double-barreled items? These are items that convey two or more ideas, so that the endorsement of the item might refer to one idea, the other idea, or both ideas, and we don't know. So here's a bad example. I support civil rights because discrimination is a crime against God. If I agree to this statement, you don't really know what I'm agreeing to. Am I agreeing to the support of civil rights? Am I agreeing to the idea that I think this is a crime against God? Am I agreeing to both? I'm agreeing, but you don't exactly know what I'm agreeing to. It's quite possible that I agree on one idea but not on the other idea. So how will I answer that? So rule of thumb, one item, one idea. Otherwise, it becomes double-barreled. Avoid ambiguous pronoun references. Murderers and rapists should not seek pardons from politicians because they are the scum of the earth. And we don't know who is being referred to by the pronoun they. Is they referring to murderers and rapists? That would be logical. But then again, if you read the items, some might construe that they refers to politicians. So that's what you mean by ambiguous pronoun references. Avoid misplaced modifiers. So here's a bad example. Our representatives should work diligently to legalize prostitution in the House of Representatives. So this can be very confusing because you seem to be communicating that there is prostitution in the House of Representatives, that which you want it to be legalized. So perhaps a better way of saying this would be, our congressmen in the House of Representatives should work diligently to legalize prostitution. Using adjective forms instead of noun forms can create unintended confusion. So here is a bad example. All vagrants should be given a schizophrenic assessment, as though the assessment is the one that is schizophrenic. A better one would be, all vagrants should be given schizophrenia assessment. My comment, however, here is that not all people, or at least some people, might not know what vagrants are. So if we can find a better term for this, then that would be better. Make sure that the statements are applicable to your audience. For example, the statement driving a car excites me. I don't know what exactly this measures. However, this is only applicable for people who actually has driven a car. And if I'm somebody who hasn't driven a car, this particular item wouldn't make sense to me. And how would I respond to this item? So that's a problem. Sometimes people who develop skills try to create negative items. I'm not sure if you know this. So a negative item is an item whose valence is the opposite of most of the items. A negative item is not necessarily an item that conveys negativity. For example, if I'm measuring depressive tendencies and I say I feel sad most of the time, that conveys negativity, but that's not a negatively worded item. Because depression as a construct is kind of a negatively valenced construct, right? So saying that I'm sad is actually a positively worded item, considering that you're measuring depression. A negatively worded item to measure depression would be I feel happy all the time, because being happy runs the opposite valence as that of what you would expect from people who are experiencing depression. Now, people write or add negatively worded items for several purposes. Now, so sometimes they add that to keep the participants alert, and in scoring that, all you have to do is to kind of reverse the score. So if the person rated 5, then it will be reversed to 1, 4 will be reversed to 2, 3 remains 3. So reverse scoring. So here we have an example here, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. For example, includes items that indicate high self-esteem. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. So that's a positively worded item because it's measuring what the scale is for. And also a negatively worded item, which is I certainly feel useless at times. So whatever my rating is for here, that will be reversed in order for that rating to be added to the other ratings for items such as I feel that I have a number of good qualities, and that sums up to the self-esteem scale. So why do we do that? Oftentimes the intention is to avoid acquiescence, affirmation, or agreement bias. However, there are a lot of disadvantage to using negatively worded items. And if it can be avoided, avoid it. Personally, at least that's my personal take. If you can avoid negatively worded items, do away with it. The reversal of the item polarity may be confusing. It might not capture the true intention of the author. And my number one problem is statistically when you run, let's say for example, exploratory factor analysis among your items, the tendency is that the negatively worded items would correlate and would form their own factor simply on the basis that they were negatively worded. So that really introduces a lot of problems in the analysis. So if I were you, if you're planning to include negatively worded items, if it's not necessary, if this is a requirement and it's okay for your teacher, if you don't include negatively worded items, don't include negatively worded items. And that concludes the third part of our series of lectures on scale development. For part 4, I will talk about response format. So again, thank you for staying. If you learned something and you want to help me, please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you on the next lecture.